Hey all, it's your friendly neighborhood repo man. I begrudgingly earn a living repossessing bank collateral in the form of motor vehicles. As you can probably guess, most people I deal with are not happy to see me. For some background, I am not your typical repo man by looking at me. Most guys I work with are over 6'3", 200 to 300 pounds, bald with a beard. I know it sounds specific, but it really holds true in my experience. I, on the other hand, am 5'11", 155 pounds, but I do have a beard. To the story, I was out working during the day and checking a retail location for a vehicle I'd been searching for. The address I was checking was located in a large mall area. I glanced in my rearview mirror to see a red Ford Focus behind me. He made a few of the same turns I did, but I didn't think twice about it. After the 7th or 8th turn that he mimicked, I decided to pull into a parking spot. I figured he would either move on or come talk to me if that was his goal. I noticed he was on the phone in my rear view. I parked the truck and watched the car as it parked about 50 feet from me. Okay, fine. I noticed the man driving the Focus was staring and pointing at me as he spoke on the phone, so I decided to ask what his deal was. When I approached, he got out of his vehicle, which was alarming, so I backed off and didn't get closer. I leaned my head out my open window and said, "Sir, is there a reason you're following me?" He moved his phone from his ear, covering the microphone, and yelled, "You're harassing people on private property. The cops are on their way." I told him that was fine and I would wait around to speak to the police. He yelled some more unintelligible nonsense as I put my window up and sat pretty waiting for the police. A few minutes later, a cruiser showed up behind me. The officer approached my window and we spoke about the situation. I told him that I'm permitted on private property unless I'm explicitly asked to leave by someone who owns the property or works security, which he agreed with. Long story short, the police told me I was good to go and asked that I not engage this man as I left. I complied and planned to move on with my day. About 20 minutes after all of this, I glanced in my rear view to see the same Focus driving a couple of cars behind me, so I parked again out of frustration. I immediately exited my truck and lit a cigarette. The man driving this car screeched up beside me and exited his car without putting it in park, rather putting it in neutral. As his car began to roll away, he was turned away from it, screaming at me about violating his right to privacy and harassing the public at this mall. I calmly told him that I was already cleared by the police department and that I was losing patience. I told him he needed to leave right then before I called the police. It was at this point that his vehicle struck the concrete base of a light pole and stopped. He started screaming and saying I crashed his car. I told him I had dash cam footage that would negate that claim. That's when he charged me. Now remember, I'm not a big guy, but I've dealt with plenty of confrontation at this job, and this guy did not appear coordinated at all. I stepped out of his path and guided him to the ground, telling him to stay down while I leave and to leave me alone. I got in my truck and left. Looking back, I absolutely should have called the police again, as I've gotten the officer's cell phone number and badge number. This story all comes to a head 2 nights later in a bizarre turn of events that genuinely scared me. At this time, I had just gotten married to my lovely wife, and we were living in our little 1-bedroom in our hip little suburb of a major Midwest city. It was a Friday night, and I decided I would go grab some beers for the wife and me to enjoy after a long week. As I was leaving the store with our booze, I saw a maroon Ford Focus in the parking lot, seemingly unoccupied. I made a mental note of the coincidence given the bizarre ordeal a couple of days prior, but didn't think much more of it. As I pulled into my apartment's parking lot, the Focus pulled in behind me. I hadn't noticed it followed me until this point. I live on the 3rd floor, so I decided I was going to hustle up the steps, just in case that this was the same guy and he'd stalked me or something in order to exact his revenge for whatever perceived transgression I'd bothered him with. My plan didn't work. He followed me to my patio where my wife was waiting, again unbeknownst to me. I was apparently not feeling very observant that night. That's when this man snuck up, crouching behind our small fence. Neither of us knew he was there until he said, still hidden from view, "Pretty girl." I snapped to my feet and began to look around when I spotted him. I knew instantly it was him. I immediately ordered my wife to go inside, lock the door, and call the police. When I approached him, he drew a small switchblade and pointed it at my belly. I began to back up with my hands up, saying something along the lines of, "We don't have to do this. What do you want?" He told me he wanted me to call my wife back outside, but that wasn't going to happen. I'd rather be stabbed than expose her to this man, so I told him as much. He lunged at me with the knife, grazing and cutting my side as I attempted to grab and redirect his forearm. Then we went to the ground where he lost his knife. I got some knees to connect to his head when the police lights became visible, and I heard shouting. Long story short, Buddy was arrested on site, and I provided the badge number and police department of the officer from work a couple of days prior in order to corroborate my claims. I decided to press charges, and as far as I know, he's awaiting a court date. I'm sure I'll have to be involved in it. So crazy, stalker guy, don't mess with my wife, and let's not meet again. I love reading posts here, and I finally made an account to share a story. So, first post ever on Reddit. I hope I'm doing this right. I am a female corrections officer, or CO, in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates, although few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county, but I work for a different agency now. This county was my first CO job years ago. Before that, I had worked in retail and customer service while studying criminal justice, so I was really inexperienced. I used to be very liberal. I'm still liberal about a lot of things, but the job changes your perspective for most people. One thing that I used to believe very strongly was that no human being could be truly evil. This particular county jail is one of the oldest in the country, so parts of it have a totally linear layout. This means you have a long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, and the COs have to walk up and down to supervise the inmates. As you can imagine, these linear layouts are not in style anymore because you cannot see every cell at the same time, but every inmate can see you. Units like this are extremely creepy. I'm going to call this corridor the condos. We did not call it that, but I do not want to share the exact term which is specific to this jail. Less than 10 years ago, a quadruple stabbing homicide happened not far from where I grew up. The murderer, Michaels, described it as a butchering, and he killed his former girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor because he came over when he heard the screams. When the police found Michaels soaked in blood and asked him what had happened, he said, "It's obvious, I just killed everyone." The cops said that he seemed completely emotionless when he said it. At that time, I had only been a CO for about 4 months, and our facility received him as a pretrial detainee. Now, obviously he wasn't our first or only murderer, but the nature of the crime, stabbings indicate a more dangerous personality than a shooting for one thing. and his lack of remorse was horrifying. He was considered a volatile inmate, so we placed him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos where a CO could always keep an eye on him. He would stand at his glass door in silence most of the day, just watching everyone. I swear he only really spoke when he had visits. He actually had a full visits list of these big goth girls who would come in and swear they were in love with him. I don't know if this means anything, but his ex was a big girl and used to draw pictures of the fat female COs. For note, he was skinny and white with brown hair. One day, I was working as a utilities officer, basically a floater who relieves people for breaks and helps out as needed. At this jail, utilities officers also got away with a ton of downtime and BSing. I was hanging out at one end of the condos where you could look down and see a lot of the jail, talking to another officer on duty. As they say, there are no secrets in jail. Plus, I was aware that there were points throughout the jail where you could hear very well into neighboring cells, that sort of thing. We were being pretty quiet though, plus we stood a good 50 yards from Michael's observation cell. Also, you have to imagine it would be difficult to stand in the observation cell and press your face against the glass to see the people standing at a right angle so far from you. I was telling the other CO a funny story about my weekend, which I wouldn't do out on a correctional unit nowadays, but we weren't getting into anything too personal either. It was a long story involving my fiancé at the time. I wrapped up talking to this CO because I had to go to a gate to relieve another officer for chow, and I had to pass Michael's cell. I didn't like walking past it because he stood there and stared at you, and back then I wasn't so good at hiding my nervousness. He always had his head slightly tilted down so you could see white under the irises of his eyes. Again, rarely saying a word. But today was different. I took one step past his door and I heard him say, "Edgecombe," in a barely audible whisper. I didn't even know he knew my name. Yes, our last names are on our uniforms, but I was never his primary officer and we'd never interacted. It caught me off guard, so instead of ignoring it, it stopped me in my tracks and I backpedaled to the door. He pointed to his mouth and I leaned in to listen. His eyes looked so dark. I remember I felt hypnotized. He proceeded to recite word for word the story I had just quietly told the other officer at the end of the condos less than 2 minutes before, even copying the sound of my voice down to a subtle lisp. This seemed to go on forever. I felt like we were the only two there. No 22 millimeters of glass protecting me. Just a 5-foot-tall female and a murderer. I remember thinking for the first time of another human being. This is evil and unfixable. Finally, I said, "Sir, did you need something?" He started to laugh hysterically and I walked away. I have been assaulted by other inmates. I've had piss thrown in my eyes. People play mind games with me constantly. I've met some very good lip readers too, but this was like something else. Now I work at a maximum security institution where I babysit the worst of the worst. I don't know how to make it make sense to you that this was the one and only time in my life where I felt inside of me like I was dealing with something not human. Michael's is in another institution now. He is on death row. He refuses to appeal. He made it clear to the press that this decision is not out of remorse. He has none. He just doesn't care, and it is most logical in his mind for him to die. Inmate Michaels, if you ever do get out somehow, please, let's never meet again. This incident happened in the summer of 2015. I live by myself in a nice house in a small town. It's a low-crime area, but there are still the occasional shady people. Anyway, at work that day during a smoke break, I watched a dog get thrown from a moving vehicle. It was in 4-lane city traffic during the start of rush hour. I ran right out there, scooped him up, and booked it back to my workplace. Amazingly, he was not injured. As a bleeding heart animal lover, I decided to take him home with me until I could figure out what to do with him. I have a large number of cats and always have. This was my first experience with a dog that I was solely responsible for. This guy was very shy. He kept his head hung, tail tucked, and was very jumpy. He just looked at me like I was about to beat him. I was clueless about dog personalities and tendencies. I just knew they needed to be taken out frequently. His first night with me, we went out about 15 times because I did not want him to mess in my house. I was having my final cigarette of the day on my porch around 10:30 p.m. The dog was on a lead, chilling under my chair as I smoked and browsed Reddit. I saw a man walking on the sidewalk that runs by my house. He kept glancing up at me before passing. Shortly after he passed my house, he stopped, turned around, and approached. "Hey, can you tell me where 302 Church Street is?" he asked. I told him I would search the address on my phone, which of course was taking a minute to pull up. He explained he didn't have a phone of his own and was trying to get to a friend's house. He kept taking small steps toward me the whole time. Finally, the address came up. "It's exactly 2 blocks north of here, right on the southwest corner of the cross street," I told him, pointing in the direction. He kept his eyes locked on me, continuing to slowly move closer. The dog started growling very softly at this point. I had forgotten he was even there until now. "Mind if I take a look at the map?" He grinned sheepishly. I'm bad with directions. I rose from my seat, pointing again. "It's truly just 2 blocks up this road. Just follow the road, 2 blocks. The house will be on your left." Making it very clear that I wasn't going to just hand him my phone. "Well, can I call them? I need to let them know I'm coming," he said, still creeping closer, extending his hand. "No," I curtly replied. "How about text them?" He continued, pushing forward. "Dude, no." I started toward my door. Just let me see your phone." He was visibly becoming angry, clearly trying to contain it and getting way too close to my porch. As a last-ditch effort to get this guy to leave, I said, "You need to get the hell out of my yard. My dog is protective. He will mess you up." I didn't know the first thing about this dog, let alone whether he had the capacity to mess someone up. I just hoped saying so would intimidate the pushy phone guy. Like I had said the magic words, the dog sprang into action. Like the wolf creature from the never-ending story, he emerged like a bullet from under the chair, growling, snarling, barking his little head off. He jerked me almost off the porch trying to get at this guy. He sounded and acted like an 80-pound attack dog, not a 40-pound timid beagle mix. I was afraid. I didn't know if the dog would turn on me. As stated earlier, at the time, I knew absolutely nothing about dogs. He backed his hind quarters into my legs, almost nudging me to the door. Still carrying on, eyes locked on the phone guy and baring his teeth. The phone guy held up his hands and backed off. He stammered something like, 2 blocks north, yeah," and began walking that way. I went inside, turned off my lights, and peeked out the window at him. He glanced at my house to make sure I was inside, turned and began walking in the completely opposite direction I had pointed him in. The icing on the cake? He pulled a phone from his pocket and raised it to his ear to make a call. The dog secured his place as a member of my family that night. He is incredibly protective of me and has frightened away another creep since this incident. He is attached at my hip and has made it known that he is grateful to be in a safe, loving home where he will never again become a projectile from a moving vehicle. His name is Hank, and I truly believe that night would have ended very poorly for me if he had not been there.